without further ado, I'm happy to welcome you all to Conference Research and Recruiting, Tips and Tricks for Meeting Participants Where They Are with Rachel Miles.
Hello, and thanks, Jack. I'm going to be presenting about doing research at conferences at a conference, a little meta, but a bit more about me. I've been at IBM about 5 years, and right now I'm doing competitive analysis across different products, but still kind of new to the role, so ask me more about that later. There's been a lot of interesting things been figuring out with like legal and everything. And then before that, I worked on our research operations team doing participant recruitment and some research repository stuff, and also worked as a researcher in our data management area. And then before IBM, I did different roles like content design and UX and product management. And yeah, I like to write and make art and stuff. So with this conference, basically, I'm going to talk to you about why are conferences a good place to do research, and then get into some real talk about conferences, and then types of conferences, and then why they're good places to leverage people who do research, and then show you some activities that you could try to do at conferences. And that's pretty much all we have time for. So why do you want to do research at conferences or try to recruit people at conferences? Well, it's a place that your target users are going to be and congregate. It's also potentially a really good way to build relationships both internally inside of your company and externally with customers. And then it's also just a really good learning opportunity for you to learn about this domain area and the people you want to research. But there's definitely some pros and cons about conferences in general. Great thing about conferences is, again, like forging relationships and connecting with product users, because that's where they are. And it's also a really good way to educate and excite people about UX. It's a great way to excite your customers about UX or product users, and also the people that you work with. It might be a really great educational opportunity for them. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Kind of the not so good side of it is that if you're doing research at a conference, oftentimes the data that you get is rarely usable enough to provide action. It's usually a way to get people interested in UX research or UX or design in general. It's so kind of thinking of, at least in my experience, other people might disagree, but I find that it's a bit more effective to think about doing research at conferences or trying to recruit people at conferences as a way of getting people interested in what you're doing, rather than as like, okay, this is my research activity. And then the thing is, conferences are expensive, and sometimes it's hard to justify the cost of sending people to conferences. So there are definite pros and cons, and after this presentation or in your experience, of course, you can decide if this is an avenue you want to do. So I've been very fortunate with my experience at IBM to be able to go to a number of IBM conferences. Since it's such a large company, we just have a number of conferences we either host or are affiliated with. And so I've kind of organized it by the pandemic timeline. But let me spend a little more time on how I've broken it into different types. So with these types of conferences I've gone to, there's really, really big conferences. There's some that are more specific to a domain. Then there's some that are very specific to a product. And then I've done a number of virtual events as well. So let's talk about these different conference types. There are the large general conferences like South by Southwest, CES, or in my experience, IBM Think. These are these ones that are just huge with multiple tracks, multiple things going on. South by Southwest wasn't it like a music festival, and now it's like a tech conference, and I think cosplayers go there. Like it's in all sorts of just different things. There's so many different people going there. So it's really good for large scale research, like on a really big level. You get to meet a lot of different people with a variety of interests. You're also unlikely to see the same person twice, which is, I didn't know what to put that in, if that's a pro or a con. It could be good, it could be bad. I don't know, depending on how you think about it. And so what's difficult about doing research at large conferences is that it takes extra effort to target specific people. So you can't really do research on like a very specific focus area. You got to be kind of more general, which can be good. It could be good or bad. It really just depends on how you frame everything, and isn't that how research always is? And so when I think about, these are categories I kind of made up too. I'm definitely interested to see if other people have different ways of classifying conferences, but I've thought about domain area conferences. So something like Adobe Max, which is an Adobe conference focused on like Adobe users, which is a very it's a Adobe product area kind of specific to this like sort of design-ish field, but then it includes film and visual design and illustration and UX. And so there's a lot of different types of content. And then the one that we have for IBM is the Data and AI Forum, which focuses on people who work with data. And that can be a lot of different roles because there's data visualization, but then there's also like back-end database development, which is a very different skill set. And then this conference, this People Who Do Research conference, I would say it's different than the next category, which is the product category, because while it's hosted by Great Question, this conference isn't about Great Question. Sure, there's product demos, but it's not a Great Question conference. It's a research conference. So this is a domain area. And for the way I think about domain area conferences is it's a good opportunity for research that can be done based like on a domain area level. And I'll show an example of one of those a bit later. But it's also good for maybe guerrilla research where you have people like coming in and talking about something, but you still can't focus on a product necessarily unless you are able to get a session about a product maybe. So domain area conferences are usually less people than one of those more general conferences, but it's still a lot of people, and you can target people, and you're probably targeting people of a certain larger category, but you're not necessarily able to immediately find a persona or target user of a certain role immediately. It'll be harder. So you still have to be kind of general in the research you're doing. Now, these product-specific conferences have been way more straightforward than the other ones in my experience. So when I was working in the data management area, I worked on IBM's database tool, DB2. And I went to this conference called the Snowflake Summit, which was a competitor conference. It was free in San Francisco, and I just went to it. And they were just doing all these sessions about, like what they're doing. And so that was a great way kind of for me to do a little like casual competitive research, and also be able to talk to people who are subject matter experts or they're not necessarily my product users, but people who would use the right target user. And then IDUG is the IBM DB2 user group conference. And that's a conference that is specifically for that product. And that was so helpful because these are the people who use the product. And so it's a really great opportunity to do very targeted research sessions. Pretty much anyone you talk to is going to be the right target user for if you're working on a specific product. And so it's nice because it's easier to build relationships. They're not as big. But then the downside to that is that you might not have enough variety of people to choose from. And my diplomatic way of saying that is that there's not a lot of maybe diversity in certain types. I don't know. That was just my experience. It's like this was like a very specific sort of person going to that conference. But when you don't have anybody, then you're kind of like, well, at least it's a starting point. So. And then there's virtual conferences, of course, like this one. And that's an opportunity to do some forum-oriented research where maybe you post questions on the Slack channel or the whatever forum you're using as the engagement for people. So the nice thing about those is it's easier for people to attend since that price point is lower. And I like it because as I think a lot of us have learned during the pandemic and being virtual, you can be a little bit more comfy and watching your sessions. You can do your stretches or go on a walk and listen to these sessions when I went to a real conference recently, I was like so tired of sitting like in the morning. The whole day hadn't even happened yet. And the downside, of course, to virtual conferences is it's a lot harder to make these personal connections because you're not seeing people face to face. So, enough about conference types. Conferences in general are a really great place to leverage people who do research. So, it's important to forge these cross disciplinary relationships before, during, and after conferences. As I'm going to show in a little bit, we've at IBM conferences, we've been able to take over like booths in the exhibit hall, and that would not have been possible without making a closer relationship with marketing and sales, because they're the ones who are like usually owning those like exhibit booth areas. But we were able to show them that, hey, doing these UX research activities, UX design and research activities is actually a really great way to draw people in and produce more engagement. So we are now friends with marketing and they love what we do. And other roles that are important to work with is, say you want to do research at a conference and you submitted a session, but your session isn't approved because your session isn't technical enough or whatever. And so then your session does not get approved, but your product managers does, because they think that the people who are attending the conference want to hear about the roadmap, or the developers session gets accepted because it's a technical kind of thing and it's a technical conference. So making those relationships, you can offer, say, like, your product manager or your developer is going to have a talk at the conference. You could offer to do a poll for them, or to somehow help them gather research data, or suggest activities that they could do. So there's a lot of ways that you can loop in these people, these other people into your research process. And then having designers there, they're really great for designing these really interactive experiences. And then they might be able to come to the conference too. And so then you're pulling them in to do the research at the conference. There's really a lot of ways you can leverage these different relationships and these cross-disciplinary roles to do research at conferences. And there's been a lot of great talks about these relationships today. Okay, this is maybe the more exciting or interesting part. Is here are some different activities that you can actually do at conferences. So I had a lot of examples and realized I wouldn't have time to get to all of them. So I'm going to have some more at the end as the appendix, in case I think these slides will get shared. And I'll also have some resources as well for you to go and look into and dig a little deeper. But there are a few different types of activities you can do at conferences. There is, like this one, this is a conference session. I am doing a conference session where I am giving a talk. If I wanted to do research, I could have made this a workshop instead of a more of a lecture format. And so you could have a design thinking workshop and introduce different research activities into the workshop. I believe this picture here on the right side is like a buy a feature game where they're selecting the feature that they want from the list. There's prioritization grids. There's a lot of different activities that you can do in a session that gets people up and moving and talking and generates a lot of great discussion and interesting findings, even if they are findings that are a little bit hard to collect in like a rigorous way. And then another thing you can do are polls. So I did this with a product manager where we were giving a demo of the product, and then we incorporated these questions into the presentation. So after showing a specific feature, we had this open-ended question where we just had them tell us what you like, dislike. It was very, very open, and we were getting all sorts of responses. And then you can also have some more structured ones with multiple choice questions. And that's a pretty nice way to gather insights. And then if the session ends up being smaller, then it can also be a good way to generate conversation. And so, like I mentioned before, with creating relationships with marketing, if you can get a booth at a conference, that's pretty great because then you can draw people in and talk to them about what you're doing. So one of the things that we did at this data and AI conference, so this is a domain area conference where these are all people who work with data and AI, but they don't specifically work on one product. So we asked them a very general question about what's your organization's readiness for AI in these different categories, like automation, and I can't read it now, so I don't remember the others. And we had them rate on a scale of not ready to ready or something like that, using Legos where they were, and then each Lego color is related to the industry. And we had all of us who were coming from our group there to to talk directly to the people who came up with them. So in the right picture, you'll see me and a design leader. We have this paper questionnaire, and we're talking to the people as they're going through it and writing down their responses. And I think we put the Lego on for them, or we just kind of told them how it worked. And it was a really, really great way to talk to people and get them interested in what we're doing as it's in our user experience program. One thing, this wasn't really a research activity, but it was playing on a little bit of our company history. So we had this tweeting typewriter, but eventually the typewriter broke. But we had this tweeting typewriter that is a nice callback to IBM history because IBM made these typewriters. And people would come over and be like, I learned how to type on one of these, or I remember having one of these. And then you just get people like, or younger people being like, whoa, that's cool. So like you get all sorts of like different stories and people just coming over. And so sometimes it's just nice to have like sort of like a attractive thing to just pull people in. One thing people really like is socks. We had socks at one conference and everyone was trying to steal our socks. And we were kind of like, you can't do the socks until you you can't get the socks until you do our activity kind of thing. So yeah, those like sort of for fun things are another thing just to draw people in. And then of course, there's guerrilla research where you could just put up an area where you've got like, okay, here's a free something for this amount of your time, and get people to come in and give feedback on specific parts of your product. And then another thing is just like guerrilla research is networking. You got to put on your social hat and ignore your colleagues that you came with if you came with anybody, and well, maybe not ignore them, but don't hang out with them all the time, and just go and talk to people who are at the event. I would go to lunch and just sit down at a table and talk to people, strike up a conversation with the people at the table, and ask them really generative questions like, how long have you been a database administrator? What tools do you use? What do you not like and dislike? And it's like really casual research. I kind of took notes and and it was a really great way to learn and connect with different people. And the nice thing too is that if it's a conference that you go to every year and it's a small one, people start to remember you and they'll recommend your program to other people. That actually happened to me this year when I went to this IBM DB2 user group conference, and they were like, yeah, doing research sessions with Rachel is really great. I really like it because I feel like I can give my feedback in a way that's being captured meaningfully. So that's just something that was kind of nice. And another thing we've done too is just like have these business cards with a QR code. And I one night I wasn't feeling that social, but what I ended up doing was I had all these business cards, and we were in this room with these tables, like these little cocktail tables, and people were standing around them with their drinks and snacks. And I was walking around the room and I was just putting the business cards on the table. And then people would talk to me. Like, I didn't have to start the conversation. People were like, well, what are you putting on the table here? And I'd be like, oh, well, this is a sign up code for our user experience program where you can give feedback on the products. And so that was another way, like when your introverted self is being really strong, you can maybe, do something like that where you just put business cards down, and if people want to talk to you, they will. And then if not, they don't have to, but they'll see the business card. And then the last kind of activity I wanted to mention are virtual events. And of course, like if I were doing an interactive activity on this virtual event, I might do some kind of workshop with a whiteboard, or I might do polls or something like that. But then there's also like community forum type questions that you can do. So we had this virtual event where for an hour, a specific hour, like 11 o'clock Eastern time or whatever it was, we had this innovation jam where every 5 minutes we would post on the IBM community forum with a prompt related to the specific product. So here's a screenshot from that product. And then for one raffle, we gamified it with raffles. For one raffle, tell us what you think about this homepage and how might it be improved. And then people could type in responses, and it was interesting to see the discussions that people had with each other. And then there's also, like if there was a research study going on a specific aspect of this product, we had a link to the screener that people could fill out for 3 raffle tickets. And that was an interesting way to get data. But kind of like I said at the beginning, all of these, I wouldn't say are really rigorous, structured research activities. They're more of a introduction to research and a way to draw people in and get them interested. It's a way to recruit people for your program and a way to get some interesting data. Like with that Lego wall, I ended up presenting it to one of our executives, and we presented the findings from that to him. And he was interested enough in it to say, hey, you should do this at the next conference. But then the pandemic happened, so then it didn't happen. But still, it was a really interesting way. And he remembered seeing it at the conference when he was there and really liked it. So all in all, conferences, they're a great way to network with others and find participants, but there's definitely some caveats and difficulties there as well, and challenges. So that's all I have. I wanted to leave maybe a little time for questions, but I did want to mention there's a number of articles on the IBM Design Medium about these ways that we've done this. Like all of the pictures I took are just from these Medium posts, and then I have a couple on my blog about some of these activities that I've done, and then I also just have some more examples in my appendix here. But I think those will get shared, hopefully. So
Thank you, Rachel. That was wonderful. Thanks so much.